Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today on the podcast, we have two very famous individuals that will need no introduction. We have Jake Whiddon. Jake, say hi.
Hi, everybody.
And Ross Thorburn.
Hi.
So, today we're going to be talking about the diploma practical block, which is a large or quite a big worry for a lot of people. And today we're going to pick the brains of these two examiners and find out what some common pitfalls or common mistakes that a lot of candidates make. So, without further ado, let's jump straight in. The practical block is generally divided up into three parts. We have the lesson planning stage, lesson delivery, and lesson evaluation. Guys, we'll talk about the lesson planning stage first. Jake.
Very logical.
And which points do you think maybe are some of the biggest worries or pitfalls that people encounter?
Surprisingly, I think it's just the aims.
Okay. How so?
Well, I get sometimes surprised at how many people come along and haven't been able just to write a nice, clear aim. So my main point is always include a context, include a function, and include some language, which people don't seem to be able to do. But it's which is unfortunate. So I don't mean to be negative, but
I will be.
Yeah. So before you come, practice writing aims.
I mean, why do you think people get this wrong, though? Is it something they just never learn to do, or is it they kind of overthink the aim because it's the diploma?
I think
maybe?
In their schools they don't. In current teaching is quite teach by numbers, and the product is given to everybody, so people aren't. There's
people don't
no
get
necessity.
The practice, do they?
Yeah, they don't have the necessity to write aims for particular learners. Mm.
Sure. Could you give us maybe a specific, I know it's maybe off the top of your head, but guys, between you maybe, could you give us like an example of a specific aim for a specific lesson?
Yeah, I think I could. By the end of the lesson, students will be better able to use the utterances mentioned here or the utterances below to give opinions on controversial topics in a school.
Perfect, yeah.
So the school would be the context. The function is to give opinions on controversial things. And the language, which you would see below, would maybe be adverbs and adjectives. By the end of the lesson, students will be better able to use adverbs and adjective combinations to give opinions on controversial topics.
Sounds great. And again, it's fairly straightforward, right? But it seems to be something a lot of people miss out, or not miss out, but maybe make a mistake, overthink, or just don't have there.
What do you guys think about the students will be better able to, or the students will be able to? Because I remember having contradictory advice on this before from people at different points in my teaching career.
Yeah, I've changed over the last couple of years. The more I observe, the more I think you can only people can, by the end of a lesson, can only be better able than they were at the beginning. You can't say someone is able to. You don't know. All you can know is that they can do it better than they did at the beginning.
Sure. I mean, it's one of those ones that I've swung backwards and forwards on over my teaching career because I was always taught to do better able to, and then I was like, well, it's such a kind of Weasley word, better. It's hard to measure, and it's not very objective. So then I didn't like it, but then I've come back to actually really liking it now because it's, again, you can't just teach the past perfect in a lesson, but maybe when you start introducing it or you're eliciting at the beginning of class, you can kind of get a sense of where your students are, even if they're newer students and you're not so familiar with them as you'll be for your own classes. But you can still draw it out of them what they know, and then you can hopefully, and the examiner will be able to see that progression as the lesson goes past.
Also, better able means that everyone has a chance of I+1. It allows for differentiation in your aims. But if you say able to, everyone must get to 1 point.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. I mean, not everyone's the same in class. Right. So if everyone can do it a little bit better than they could before, everyone's able to learn something.
And you might also say that if you say can do or is able to, then maybe your aims aren't difficult enough, because if every student can hit it every time, then you're not pushing them at all, right?
Yeah. So better able.
Good stuff
for that.
Okay. Ross, maybe let me just pick your brains on maybe learner profiles.
Yes.
What kind of, learner profiles have you seen? Generally, are they pretty good, or what areas do you think could be improved?
I think it varies a lot, doesn't it? But I think with that, you want to try and get just as much relevant information about the students as possible. So what they do, what they're learning English for, what their interests are. So all the sort of like sociological background of the students, about them as people. And I think you want something about them as language learners as well, the things about like their preferences, activities maybe you've seen them enjoy in the past in class, students that they work well with, their friends in the class, that kind of thing. And then also I think that the third important component is them linguistically. So strengths and weaknesses, common errors, phonologically, grammatically, lexically, all that kind of stuff. And I think if you've got those different parts, then I think the problem some people have with the learner profiles is they see it just as a thing by itself, but it's really a means to an end, isn't it? That if you have all that great information in there about them, then that lets you do all that. You mentioned differentiation a second ago, Jake. It lets you do all that kind of differentiation in class, and it lets you pick a topic, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about context later, but it lets you do all those things in a way that's going to be relevant to the students.
Definitely. Do you think that oftentimes trainees have a difficulty linking that knowledge and the learner profile to their lesson plan itself?
Yeah, because I think people see it as, I have to write these learner profiles, and they don't see it as it's a means to an end, isn't it? It's like you're writing this to help you plan. You're not just writing it so that you can turn it in and it's a nice piece of work.
Sure. I mean, that's the thing I often see as well, is that it's exactly as you said, they see it as a different project. Like, okay, this is a unit in and as itself. It's isolated. I've done those. Now I can just focus on my lesson plan. But it should be so informed, right? As Jake mentioned, context earlier. I mean, where do you get the context from? Well, you get it from the information you have in the learner profile, right?
Yeah.
So they should be so interlinked that it should be,
Well, the second point on the lesson planning pro forma says tasks and activities match lesson objectives and learner profiles.
Exactly.
So you can't just have... You then need to think about, does this activity going to work with this group? What I like to see in learner profiles too is when they're developing over by the third lesson, for example, that you have examples in the learner profile of what happened in the last class with that learner. And the reason you've chosen to only work in pairs in this class is because you've noticed that most of your learners in this class only want to work in pairs, for example, and not just the things that Ross mentioned, but also start to add what type of learners are they when they're in a class.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, that observable behaviour that they can see, or you can see as a teacher, put it all in. You get new information every lesson.
And you also get, I think the thing that people miss a lot is it's not just information that you got from your class, right? Like you'll probably be teaching with a group of maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 other people who'll have the same students as you. They're seeing things in their classes that they can tell you about, and you can add that into your learner profiles as well.
Definitely. I think another big one, or maybe ask you guys what you think, but is lesson point 8 objective, or the criterion that says, plan clearly indicates when and how assessment of learning objectives will take place. Can you maybe comment on that?
I think that's sort of like your overall...
I mean, it's one that you've picked out, and I know that you are usually someone who picks up on this, well, the lack of it in
It's
plan.
often missing, isn't
what
it?
do you want to see in a plan?
Well, the fact it's there to start.
But what is it for our listeners today?
Sure. When you have your aim, that you mentioned earlier, Jake, you know what you're pushing your students to produce and the output you want to hear or see in the class. We want to know, as examiners, where in the lesson plan this is going to happen ahead of time. And if that's not there, when we have that 10 minutes beforehand, when we're flipping through the lesson plan, we would like to see this clearly signposted so we can go in there with this knowledge ahead of time.
I'd say it's simply just what the students will be able to do at different stages and how you'll know that they'll be able to do that.
It's how you'll know. So what I've seen some people put in checkpoints, so they'll say checkpoint at the end of this stage, and it'll be look at all people's piece of paper. It could be as simple as check that everybody has written the correct thing on the piece of paper.
Right.
It might be that simple. Or when monitoring, check that people are using the language that I want them to be using at this point. The other way is when you can integrate those into the whole flow of the class, where you can't move on to stage 3 if you haven't done stage 2. So it all sort of the checkpoint then becomes the flow of the class.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely. And if that's not happening, then there could be an argument, how do you know you're not leaving students behind?
Yeah.
Precisely. Okay, that's really good for lesson planning. I think those are probably the most important points maybe that people often miss out on. Let's move on to lesson delivery. Now, of course, we've talked about this and you guys have seen the pro formas. You know there are 4 bolded points, which are essential and probably the most important, because even if you get enough marks to pass the class overall, if you fail on one of these 4 points, you will fail the lesson delivery overall. So these are LD1, LD2, LD11 and LD12. Should we make sense to talk about these first, I guess, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So LD1 is teacher creates environment conducive to learning and maintains levels of motivation and interest. Question for you both. What does a teacher need to do to show this or to demonstrate this?
It really, for me, it means don't be a dick. Really. That's a big part of it. This is one I don't see people failing on often, but when I have, it's people that behave aggressively towards students. I think that's the sort of thing that, would not create an environment that's conducive to learning.
I think that this criteria is in there as kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card for an assessor when a teacher has done everything they should do in class except if they got angry at a student or if they snapped at a student or they ridiculed a student. You can just quickly say, right, you failed, because you didn't create an environment that was conducive to learning and motivation. And the other one is if you're very boring. I mean, it doesn't happen very often, and you wouldn't be getting to this stage if you were. But if it just happens that the class is so demotivating, people are actually sort of falling asleep or they're playing on their phones the whole time. Yeah. So, I mean, really, this is the easiest one to pass. You need to be nice, smile, use people's names, and we will write that type of thing in the descriptors. We'll write, use names throughout. Topic was relevant to the students. The activities were catered for different learning preferences and that type of thing. So if you're having a class that has a lot of variety in it, you're probably going to do okay with this. If you smile, you're going to do okay.
Sure. Like you say, it is the easiest one to pass. And for me, this one, it seems to be very much kind of almost personality driven.
Yeah.
If you're a decent person, you'll tend to pass this. And thankfully, we've only seen someone fail on this once or twice. Yeah. Right?
Not very often.
It's very, very rare.
Yeah.
And it is, like you say, because they either maybe mistakenly had a competitive element to a class where they humiliated a student in front of the class by accident, misread the class and snapped at a student or something like that. Okay, moving on to LD2, which is genuine and meaningful communication between learners takes place. I mean, the professional descriptors from Trinity say that student-to-student interaction must focus on study, development and use of language, items or skills in real or realistic contexts. Jake, would you like to comment on this one for me?
Yeah, this one for me should be another quite easy thing to do. So if you want to do well on this one, you pick a context and you make sure that the students in your class are speaking to each other using language in that context. For example, can you think of an example?
Oh, that's a great thing about Audacity, isn't it?
Yes.
Sure. So I remember a good example of this before was it was the teacher taught students descriptive words. It's that small black thing that you use to blah, blah, blah. And the students had to go into go into a shop and try to buy something from the shop, but they didn't know the word, right? So it was very clear that some communication was taking place because you'd see, maybe they were buying speakers and you didn't know the word for speakers. You go, I want to buy those, things are normally black and they have a wire and you use them for playing music. And they go, oh, do you mean this? And it was very easy to see that there was some genuine communication going on there.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think for this one as well, I see a lot of, thankfully not a lot, but a few lessons where people trip up on this. Oftentimes it's if they're doing a writing before they do maybe a final activity, or they're doing something where the students are able to write down, or they have a prompt card, and in their activity where student-student interaction takes place, what would have been a beautifully set up activity where they can students have an ability to make a choice of the language they use, it's negated by the fact the students are using the prompt cards or using their pre-written dialogue to read off to each other, to tick the boxes that the teacher's using. And that means that we can't tick that box that's genuine and meaningful. Because as well as having that choice, that student-student interaction, it has to be, as Jake says, using that context, but also a choice the students are making in the moment.
And it could be as simple as just saying, if you're talking about a movie, you might just say, now ask your partner if they like the movie.
Right.
And then suddenly there's meaning in it because they're talking about a movie they want to talk about. I've seen classes where people come in and they've prepared all these movies from other countries that none of the students have ever seen. Then they have to talk about all those movies. And all they had to do was say, tell me about your movie that you last saw. And suddenly that went from a role play class with no meaning to the students to a class full of meaning for the students with exactly the same language.
Definitely. Cool.
Just saying on the last note on that, just a tip, it is the number one thing that people fail on. It's the most common one, which I think we've all failed people on that. And we're not trying to say come along and fail. But the point is, it is the one that people trip up on, because I think that the textbooks that they're using now create that context for them, for the students already, right?
Yeah.
So they have a story, or they have the world created by the product. But in this, you need to create that meaningful interaction between the students. It's up to you as a teacher.
In a context based on the learner profiles.
Yeah.
Which segues beautifully into LD11.
Yes.
Which is the teacher focuses on the use of language in context. And again, from the Trinity official guidelines, it says study and practice of language/skills must take place in clearly defined settings, situations and scenarios. Ross, can I ask you to comment on that one?
Yeah, sure. The best advice I heard from someone on finding a context was not just looking at the language that you've come up with for the lesson and then going, where would I say this? You know, putting the language that you plan to teach in the corpus and then seeing what contexts came out from the corpus, because then you're accessing, you know, a vast amount, you know, billions and billions of utterances to find a genuine context rather than just something that you've thought up off the top of your head. Or the other way of going about it, I think, is just you can come up with a context first and then come up with a language later. And I think there's a bit of a reciprocity between the two, isn't it? That you can go back and forward between them and tweak that.
One thing I also, as you remember, that doesn't just mean the whole class context. It means that new language needs to be presented in context. It means that language should be presented in a text, or in a listening, or in a newspaper article, or on a TV show. The language needs to be there for the students to pull out and notice and find on their own. That's what it means. And as soon as you put a bunch of words up on the board and say, now learn these new words, that's no context. You need to present the language in a listening or an authentic way, in a text.
I think for the best classes, we see the context runs right from the second the class starts, or even before the class starts, when the students first enter the room to when the students leave, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I'd agree. It does. You know, it's kind of the most kind of almost like method acting, right? You know, it runs the whole way through.
One tip I've heard people use, and I really like this one, is when they say, once you've come up with your context and you're looking for that language, just a little side note, say the language out loud to yourself, and if you wouldn't say it, don't teach it. So only teach language that you think that you probably would use or hear. And the best way to find language is listen to what people say.
Yeah,
around you.
The last time I had to teach a class, and it was on advice, I just waited until, I think it was on the Cert TESOL in Guangzhou, and one of the trainees came to ask someone for advice. And all this advice language came out that was completely natural. It was great. You could just write it down and then teach something authentic to the students.
Yeah, language doesn't exist in a perfectly structured curriculum, linear curriculum. It exists all around you. So pull that language from around you and then see, does it match your learners?
Profiles.
Exactly. Actually, no, some really, really good points there, gents. I think this one is the one. It's so simple to get right, but it's so often not there. I like your idea, actually, Ross. I hadn't heard that before about using a corpus to kind of check after you've got the context. One of the things I saw in the last practical block was one of the trainees who, he chose language that was very natural for himself to say.
Right.
But I think we were both looking at each other and scratching our heads going,
oh, why geezer? Students had to introduce themselves to each other.
But not that, but it was so odd. I was like, oh, would you say this naturally? And it was, I think the examiner, maybe it'd been you, Jake, who you were talking to him.
A theatre blockbuster.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was a theatre blockbuster. Thinking
it was something like that, and he thought that was extremely high frequency, and we were like, well, I've never kind of heard that said before. And there are a few other bits and pieces like that. So almost if you're a bit of a weirdo and you know you are,
good point.
then maybe just check with somebody who's kind of
or again
normal.
put it into a corpus, right?
Precisely.
If you've got a billion word corpus and this collocation doesn't exist, then
Because I actually looked it up in a corpus after.
Right, we did. Yeah. I often sit when I'm observing with a corpus open. I use the Brigham Young one, which isn't great, but it just quickly, if I see some collocations that someone's teaching, think, is that very common? And then at the end, you can use it in the evaluation and say, actually, there's only 3 times this has ever been said together in 100 different TV shows.
Because I don't know about you two, but I often find that after living abroad for such a long time, you start to forget, like, is this a natural way of speaking? And then sometimes I'll second guess, what I think and go, well, maybe that's common in Australia or New Zealand or America or something. I've just not been exposed to it. But the corpus just makes it very objective.
Be careful though what corpus is. If you use something that is looking at newspapers, for example, remember we were having a look and it said top 10 words, and one of them was military.
Yeah, guns. I think was in the
guns
top 10.
and military, and you're thinking, well, I should teach that, but no, military is not clearly not one of the top 10 words we use in everyday speech.
Yeah.
It is in The Guardian, probably.
Yeah. And likewise, if you're using the Simpsons corpus, you might get very different results to newspaper corpus. Okay, cool.
I'll ask you about this then, Dave. So this is another of the 4 must-pass criteria, and it is there is clear development of language/skills development taking place. So what does this mean for you, and what were your Dave Weller's top tips for making sure that it happens?
Make sure there is development taking place.
Yeah. What is development then?
Well, I'd like to refer that back to the aims that we were talking about earlier when we were talking about better able to. And before we kind of talk in more depth about it, like the key point in the wording here for me is the evidence of language/skills taking place. So it's kind of, I would say it doesn't have to be all about language sometimes. If you can see students are getting better at maybe listening, for example, you're teaching them or listening for gist, listening for specific information, maybe doing a timed activity, and you can actually show they're getting better or faster at using that skill.
Or phonology.
Any of that, those kind of areas. So it doesn't necessarily have to be language they're getting better at. So development means to me that you can see observable behaviour that has improved over the course of the class. And hopefully that's related to the aims, not just incidental language or skills. But yeah, for me, that's what that involves.
But it is hard to see.
It is.
Like, what is evidence that someone is learning something? And what a lot of people will try to do at the end of a class is say, well, they could all use the language. That doesn't mean any learning took place.
Sure.
I'll take it back to the thing we said at the beginning about I+1. It has to be difficult.
Jake, what's I+1?
Oh, sorry,
gloss that for our listeners in case they're not familiar.
Input +1, so the idea that you're always pushing people just a little bit above where their language is. One technique I see a lot of people doing is you elicit till you've exhausted all answers. Once those answers have been exhausted and there's that beautiful sound of silence, then you know the next thing you're going to say is probably something they're going to learn. It's because they don't know the answer. But you can never ever know if they didn't know the answer until you push them to that point where there's the +1 moment.
For me, the equivalent of that is kind of, now I'm kind of hesitant to mention this because I don't want people to go, oh, it's this, but it's kind of the test, teach, test sort of methodology, right? Whereas you're kind of, this for me is where maybe the Trinity pro forma becomes a little bit artificial, because you have to demonstrate to the examiner that they didn't know this language or maybe couldn't use it as well, or you have to demonstrate development. So whatever they can show, you need to get them to show what they know at the beginning of class, either through elicitation, as Jake just mentioned, or, because if you just have them doing a writing task, for example, the whole class, and then at the end you go, okay guys, now do student-student interaction and show me some communication, and they all do it perfectly and fluently, then as an examiner it's extremely difficult to find that evidence of development taking place. So doing some kind of activity at the beginning where the examiner is able to see or hear that where the language is roughly, so the examiner can kind of roughly tune where the students are, and then they're able to peg that development as the class progresses.
And once again, comes back to your learner profiles. The more you know your students, the better you'll know where to push them.
That's true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because if you come in and you're giving them a really wide range and they're kind of, you're not sure, essentially. And a good tip for that is when you're doing your learner profiles, like Ross says, just hang out with your students on your days off when you're not teaching or you're not, in the classroom. Come in, hang out with the students, they're usually very friendly, have a chat with them, and even kind of in conversation insert that target language you're thinking of doing, and so you can really find out where they are. And that way, that's a very easy way, that's Dave's top tip, of where to find out where your students are the day before.
It's a good rationale, isn't it, then, that you can stick in your learner profile that I heard the students not being able to say this. Just a little point about this. I mean, you spoke a lot, Dave, about the evidence being for the examiner, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that it's also something that's useful for the teacher, and that for me, if you don't do that at the beginning of the class and you don't do something to check, in my opinion, you as a teacher, you don't really know what your students know and don't know. And in the worst classes, not the worst classes, that's the wrong way of phrasing, but I've seen classes where the teachers picked something they've not checked and the students knew all the language. And it was really just a complete waste of an hour. It was a pleasant hour for people, but they didn't learn anything. And for me, just doing something at the beginning of the class where the students are speaking or it's something that in some way mirrors what you're going to be doing at the end of the class is a great way for three people, right? For the examiner, right? So that they can give you a distinction for this. For yourself, so you know where to push your students. But last of all, and maybe most important of all, for the students themselves. So at the end of the hour, you can show them, this is what you were doing or what you were saying. I heard you say at the beginning of the lesson, and this is what you said at the end. And then you're really doing what I think is LD20, right? That you're encouraging learners to evaluate and reflect on their own learning.
Let's come back to that one. But what Ross just said, I 100% agree in this idea of mirroring, but then that links back to your context again. And if you can have students walking into a context where they have to hear that language or they can see something where they have to use that language in some way. You're just walking around, monitoring, checking, seeing where are they now. And at the end, they can really feel themselves doing it again.
Yeah.
It also helps with your lesson planning if you know that in every class, whatever I did at the beginning is what I'm going to do at the end. It makes it quite,
Definitely. But the way, again, to keep hammering on that learner profile, that's as Ross said, the better your learner profiles are, the more comprehensive they are, the easier time you'll have that. You're the less blind you'll be when you start doing this in class.
There are little things though, like if you see a whole class and there's no error correction, but seeing error correction is a chance to see learning happening. Because I made a mistake, I got it better, maybe it was a slip or a mistake, but if it was an actual mistake, and you can see that student use it properly again, that's a really beautiful way to see it for yourself too. Like, wow, and you feel good. Yeah. When you see someone make a mistake 3 times, and then by the end of the class they're not making that mistake because you've given them opportunities to speak, awesome. You know that they've learned something. Even if it's only that one word, but they still got something out of that class.
Yeah. And the student walks away really happy. They go, hey, I have a visceral reaction. I now know that I know this word which I didn't at the beginning, which is awesome.
Jake, what does visceral mean?
I don't know.
Go and look it up in a corpus, Ross. So, moving on from lesson delivery then to lesson evaluation. And this is the part where after the class, you have a 20-minute reflective period where it's strongly suggested you take this pro forma, you look through and think about your lesson that you've just taught. So when you come into the examiner, when they ask you questions, you're able to give some sensible, logical answers. Guys, are there any open questions to both of you? And are there any areas that perhaps trainees often fall down or get wrong for this section?
Yes. So I would say, at least for the first one, the most obvious one, discussion of the achievement of learning objectives, you'll often hear, so again, it's about the learning objectives, so it's about the students and what the students achieved. You often hear teachers come in and go, oh yeah, well I felt I did really well and I was happy with my board work and I thought my listing was really good. And there's no mention of the students. Right? So for me, that's a big no, just talking about yourself. And you want to focus that as much as possible on the learners.
With the students, you say, oh, so tell me what the students got out of the class today, which is usually the sort of question we ask. And they say, oh yeah, the students all achieved the aim. It was great. They could all do it. And you're like, okay, so tell me when that happened. Oh, at the end of the class, they could all do it. And then when you actually push them to give you tangible examples of it, they can't actually think of a time in the class. So what type of answers do we want to hear, Dave?
We want to hear, observed behaviour answers, so we actually know that you've seen or observed the students achieve that behaviour. And then again, this loops back round to the assessment checkpoints in the lesson plan that we spoke about earlier. So if you have those in your template that you're using to lesson plan, it becomes even easier to then talk about this in the lesson evaluation. Everything's there for a reason,
Can you give an example of what it would sound like?
Today I heard little Jimmy produce the past perfect continuous in that sentence where he was talking to Jane about this, which he couldn't do at the beginning because he got that wrong. I was really happy with little Jimmy.
Yeah. And if we hear that answer, specifically mentioning a student at a specific point in the class using specific language, you'll do very well.
Precisely. Cool. Before actually we pick any more words, I often hear, again, this is kind of a personality thing, but maybe it's because people haven't been observed for a long time or because maybe they feel like it's a high-pressure environment. But when we start asking them, they get very defensive very quickly, and they assume that if we ask them a question about one of these, then they must have done something wrong.
That's a really interesting point. I think that's, again, it's some sort of effect of the way that they've been observed in the past. Like, Jake, you were talking at the beginning about people not getting much practice writing aims. But this almost shows that maybe what happens to a lot of people is they get observed and all the questions afterwards are this coaching method of trying to get people to admit to what they've done wrong, which isn't what this is about at all, is it?
Be really clear, the evaluation is an evaluation. It's not a coaching session.
Sure.
That's what it is. It's a test.
So this is the problem, right, that I've noticed with a few people. So because you're marked on how effective your evaluation is, if you and there's no false modesty here, right? So if you say, I thought my lesson was really bad, and actually it was pretty good, we will mark you down for that because you're clearly not very self-reflective or aware.
So I would say you almost don't want people to say it was bad or it was good. You just want to say to what extent did you achieve what you were aiming to achieve. Because at the end of the day, what do good and bad mean for a lesson?
Sure. Well, what I mean for that is, like, again, going back to this personality thing. So if we say, like, LE2, so, tell me about the phonological aspect of your class. And they go, oh, no, my phonology, it was really bad. I didn't do that, and I meant to do this, and I did because they both think that the reason you're mentioning it is you're picking up on areas of weakness, perhaps. So if we mention an area, it's because, again, it's all in the lesson evaluation pro forma, so make yourself familiar with it. But it's because we're trying to evaluate how you're evaluating yourself in the class.
Which, if you've done section 2 of your portfolio, the developmental record, you will have done at the end of every class anyway. And it's just exactly what you would have been doing there anyway. So this should be quite second nature to you if you've already done those.
I think that the challenge for a lot of people here is that it's not very long, right? It's 10 points that we need to get through in a 20-minute period. And if you think every time that you ask a question, that's 10 or 15 minutes gone. So you have to get across everything you want to get across. Sorry, 10 or 15 seconds. You have to get quite a lot across in a period of 90 seconds. And so I would say to people, take notes and write bullet points and score off the points.
You can bring notes in.
Score off the points that you want to make as you go through them and make sure that you get through everything that you want to say.
Definitely. And also, relating to that, being concise, Jake, you mentioned earlier that it's, if we're looking for observable behaviour, but you're not giving us the answer we want, we'll keep pushing you and asking again until we actually find the answer we want. And that takes time. So, the longer we take trying to get the answer. So be concise, look at the pro forma and come in with some bullet points ahead of time.
Specific examples of what you saw or what you heard.
Definitely. Are there any others there that maybe people, some of the later ones maybe about are quite kind of difficult, I think, like LE6, like cultural and L1 factors and class dynamics?
That's something that people kind of skip over because they don't want to discuss. And the L1 one is so easy to discuss because you all know who these learners are. You know the classic fossilized errors that come through from Mandarin. There's probably something phonological in there about stress and rhythm. There's probably something grammatical about past tense and things like that. You know they're going to come through. For cultural factors, you can mention things like turn-taking in class or loss of face in class, and all those things they probably will come up. So just, or maybe Mary didn't want to interact with this group because she's a little bit older, which is a cultural thing, can come under the cultural thing, and maybe in her generation she feels a bit, uncomfortable with this. Mention that stuff.
And guess what? You don't have to think about this off the top of your head. It should be in your learner profiles already.
Yay, learner profiles.
Well, that's pretty much everything that I'd like to talk about today. I think we've covered quite a lot there in the lesson planning, lesson delivery and lesson evaluation stage. Before we wrap it up finally, are there any kind of general guidelines or Ross or Jake's top tips?
I would just say that I think some people seem to see this as something different to good teaching, and I don't think it's like Trinity came up with a bunch of things to describe what they want. They should be describing what great teaching is. So go in, teach a great class, and you'll probably do extremely well. Obviously, read these things and do your homework, but it's not like we're asking for something completely different from what you should be doing every week anyway.
My top tip would be meaning. That we only learn a language, really, to be able to talk and express ideas to other people. And the reason why so many people who have learned English in this country and other countries can't speak the language is because they had no reason to speak it. So it comes back to that, the same thing, context and meaning. And if everything you're doing and every time you're planning and everything you're thinking about is there a reason for my student to be using this language, then you'll probably have a good class.
Lovely.
What
Jen?
about
Of course,
you, David?
yeah. What's Dave's top
What's
tip?
Dave's top tip?
Ooh, Dave's top tip would be, I'd go actually with something we haven't mentioned yet so far, which would be
Connections.
it would be about recycling materials, I guess, because I think a lot of these things, it's just as the way context runs throughout the class. Don't try and have too many materials. Try and use one or two main pieces of material, and then pull everything from that as you go through. So if you have a listening, for example, you can pull the vocabulary, the lexis from it. You can pull the grammar out of that. You can pull the phonology out of that as well, and recycle that around. It kind of makes it easier for the students, and also hopefully will serve as a great model for any kind of final activity or meaningful communication at the end. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thanks,
It's been a
Dave.
pleasure to pick the brains of the most epic examiners known
In
to
this
date.
room today.
Cool, thanks. All right, signing off. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Peace.
Roll,